Hello and welcome to Season 2 of Scheming, the Place North podcast that gives property folk a platform to talk about three schemes they think about a lot. I'm your host, Dan Whelan, Deputy Editor of Place Northwest. Today's guest is one of the country's leading authorities on regeneration, having been involved in transformational schemes up and down the country over the last 20 years. He's also a triathlete and an avid follower of rugby league. Joining me today to talk about the three schemes that he thinks about the most is Phil Mayall, Managing Director of Muse. Phil, welcome to the pod.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks for the kind introduction. I'm leading authority.
Yeah.
Wow, you tell some people in our team.
I like to think so. So before we get into the schemes, and there's three really good ones to talk about today, I want to talk to you about what you do outside of property. So I mentioned there that you're a triathlete, but you also recently, relatively recently, took on a national remit for Muse. So do you still have time for the triathlon stuff, or has it kind of been put on the back burner?
Yeah, truth be told, it probably went a bit more on the back burner last year. So I picked up this job in the previous October 23, and I made the kind of foolish assumption that being the MD of a region would be the same as being the MD of the national business, and I was quickly kind of disabused of that assumption. And obviously there's a lot more travel because I'm now without office. Okay. We're sat in the northwest, but I spread my time across our four offices, and just finding a way of fitting stuff in around it was a bit of a challenge, and there's also the kind of mental side of it that I don't think people appreciate, that you can only really perform the physical stuff if your head's in the right place, and you can get very tired very quickly just with the day-to-day grind.
How do you make sure that you stay sort of sharp and focused? I guess that's where exercise comes in, I guess.
It does, and it's about getting past it. So the natural thing is you take on a new role, and that becomes all consuming, and then naturally the physical, the running, the exercise, the swimming and everything takes a back seat. But you quickly realise that you're not performing to your best at work because you're not in the best place. And the beauty of triathlon training is that it's varied, so it's not as repetitive because obviously you've got three disciplines within one. The other is that particularly with swimming, you know, looking at a black line for an hour and a half, there's only so much thinking you need to do about the set you're doing, and then your mind's free to wander, and you get a lot of thinking time for work. Okay. So you're naturally kicking things around that then when you hit the office, suddenly it's, you know, you're taking things as they come, and there's not a lot of time to think. So so you just need to kind of get over the temptation to get sucked into work too much, and recognise that performance is a wider thing than just being sat at a desk.
Yeah, absolutely. So have you got any races coming up then?
Yeah, I've got a few booked. I've tried not to get ahead of myself this year. So last year, what I normally do is book almost the year's races at the beginning of the year, and it cost me a fortune last year because a mixture of injury and work. Paid to a lot of that, but so this year I've booked up to halfway through the year. So I've got a couple of sprint and standard triathlons, Westline, Southport, and then I'm doing a half iron middle of the year in Ullswater.
Wow.
So
and have you done a full Ironman?
Yeah, I did Bolton a few years ago, but those who know me will be able to challenge that, in that I did it the year that really hot summer when there were a lot of fires up on the moors. Okay. And they had to cut the bike by I think it was about 20 miles short. So, right, okay. So proper Ironmen who I know will point out to me that I haven't actually done a full one.
Is that still on the bucket list then?
It's still on the bucket list, but my wife is absolutely brilliant with putting up with my obsessions.
Yeah, because it's a lot of training, isn't it?
It is, and you can kind of do a half iron off pretty standard, I don't know, 12 hours, 13 hours a week training, an Ironman, you can be, you're 6 hours a day at the weekends.
Wow.
And when you've got a full-time, full-on job... So
and a family as well.
And a family, yeah. So it was the one and only time that after the race she came up to me and said... It was more of a statement than a question. We're not doing another one of those for a while, are we? So when it settled down, I kind of agreed that that when the other thing about being a triathlete is you measure your life in age groups.
Okay.
So you kind of, I'm in 50-54 age group at the minute.
You recently just...
Yeah, so I'm 51 now. Okay. So just last year I stepped up the age group, and you like to think that you're at the sharper end of that age group because of age, obviously. And so I agreed with her that quite a good time to go back and do a full one would be at 55. One, because we got 3 kids, daughter's 23, and we got 15-year-old twin lads, that they would be off at uni or doing whatever they're doing, so there'd be less pressure. So makes 55 sense. I could do well, hopefully, and there'd be less family pressure. So that was the deal. But we'll see in 4 years' time. Although I went out for a run just before I came here and tweaked my Achilles, so I might not get to 55, frankly.
Well, watch this space. So exercise and obviously doing triathlons is a good way to sort of keep your focus sharp. Because you're very busy. Muse are extremely busy alone and part of ECF as well. You've got projects all over the country, regenerating town centres. What is the hardest thing about being a developer in 2025? In regen, I can only talk about the areas we work in, obviously, but in regen terms, it's a couple of things. It's more complex than it's ever been. Mm-hmm. So if you think most of the residential we do is mid to high rise, so you've got the Building Safety Act side of things, all entirely necessary in its intent. Its delivery is falling short at the minute, so that adds complexity to programs and what have you. Obviously, we've got a period of time where probably certainly in housing, the housing element of regen, it's never been more necessary, whether that's social through to market rent or for sale. But there's less money to go around. And I mean, you're running your very worthy Mind the Gap campaign. Viability campaign, yeah.
And it's, look, the simple fact is, you can, in crude terms, you could run concentric circles from Manchester Town Hall and very quickly you're into it needs support. Yeah. So the most difficult bit is that I often waffle on about this, but I don't know if you're familiar with it. Maybe one or two of your listeners might be familiar with it, but there's a Jim Collins, who's a kind of business author and maybe a brilliant book called Good to Great, one of many, but he has this thing that he came up with called the Stockdale Paradox, which was named after a guy, James Stockdale, who was an American pilot in Vietnam, and he questioned him after the war, not after the war, when he was doing his book, obviously after the war, but when he was writing his book, and he said to him, how do you sorry, I should say, he was shot down and he was the highest ranking American serviceman held in the Hanoi Hilton. Okay. And he said, how did you cope? How, not knowing, whether you're ever going to be released? And he said, who were the ones who really struggled with it? And he said, that's a really easy question to answer. It was the optimists who struggled. And he said, what do you mean? And he said it was the ones who convinced themselves that they were going to be home by Christmas. And they weren't. And then they convinced themselves, and he broke them. Whereas what you had to do was hold two things. One, you didn't know when you were going to get out. But the paradox being, but you knew you were going to be. Okay. And you hold to the two things at the same time. And regen is very much a Stockdale paradox thing, that you cannot write a development appraisal that shows that it works, but you'll find a way. Okay. And quite often, people who come into regen, they immediately become disheartened when they generate the first development appraisal, and they go, I'm never going to make this work. Well, what you do is you just work, and it sounds really simple, but you just keep going until you find a way. And that comes down to then the kind of partnerships ethos that what you don't do is do that and put it in the drawer and don't tell people who you're working with.
Okay.
Before you even step foot into anything looking like formal, you lay out the challenges, and then you go together and you work together to resolve the challenges. And I think so that's the most difficult bit, that the Stockdale paradox, being able to hold that eventually you'll find a way of delivering, whereas on the face of it, the paper in front of you is telling you that you can't.
Yeah, because I guess there's a lot of stuff right now that you're involved in that, you know, if you wanted to go and lay a brick tomorrow, you probably wouldn't be able to.
No.
But it's like you say, it's that partnership approach.
Yeah.
What was that book? Good to Great by
Jim Collins.
Okay,
It comes
great.
up in
Good one for our readers our listeners. Sorry to dig out.
And the book itself, if people are really interested in that as a concept, James Stockdale wrote his kind of memoir about it, called In Love and War, and it's quite an interesting book because he writes it with his wife, who and they write chapter by chapter.
Oh, wow.
So he writes a chapter, she writes a chapter, so you get to see it from both sides. So it's quite an interesting book.
Well, we expect something from you and your wife down the line about her challenges trying to sort of handle you and all your hobbies.
Wow, yeah.
Okay, let's get into it now then. So as you know, on today's podcast, I'm going to ask you about 3 schemes. One that you're most proud of, the one that you wish you had done, and the dream project. So without further ado, let's get into it. Which project are you most proud of in your 20 years doing this? What's the one that stands out?
I mean, it comes as no surprise to anybody who knows me that, and I think I'd be forgiven by other colleagues for naming it, but Salford Central.
Okay.
Purely because, number of reasons really. The what we have achieved and still achieving there as a business.
Yeah. So this is the regeneration of brownfield land around Salford Central Station, essentially.
In effect, yeah.
Thousands of homes, hundreds of thousands of square foot of workspace.
Yeah.
And you've been on the job for how long?
So I've been with the business a few years. So I've been with Muse, what was AMEC, just coming up for 19 years, and my former colleague and a really good regeneration professional in his own right, Richard Ingham, Generate, actually started the scheme. And when I see him now, he winds me up saying that he gave it me as a tap-in. But he did. We signed our development agreement in December 2006 with the council, and I picked it up from Richard when he left to form Generate with Mike Smith in January 2008.
Okay.
So over 15 years, which is... I've already given my age away before, haven't I? So you can work out that it's the best part of a third of my actual life, let alone working life.
That is a long time.
Yeah.
Why is it the one that you're most proud of? Is it the scale? Is it the individual elements of it?
I think it's everything. I think so. Scale. I mean, how often do you get to regenerate 50 acres of a city centre? So I think scale is a big part of it. I think it goes back actually to our previous conversation. Actually, the scale of the challenge. And I remember doing the development appraisals, and it was just after the financial crash, and I had a meeting in Warrington, and this taught me a massive lesson. So I had a meeting in Warrington. We used to have a JV with the United Utilities at Lingley Mere, around their headquarters, and I was at a meeting there with Matt Crompton, our former MD, and now retired, and I remember nervous as anything. I'd run these appraisals, and I said to Matt, can I have 10 minutes after the meeting? And in typical Matt style, he said, there's a pub down the road, let's go have a pint and a chat. So we did that. I said, I've got a bit of a problem, and he said, what is it? And I don't know if you remember, but after the financial crash, office yields went from something like prime yields, went from something like 4.5% to 7 and 8%.
Yeah.
And of course, New Bailey was a big part of, or the plans for New Bailey was a big part And the idea was that we were locking value in there and using that to cross-subsidise the residential, which is what we ended up doing. But overnight, the appraisal went from something positive to being almost £100 million underwater.
Wow.
And we were like millions in. And this taught me so much. I remember looking at him thinking he was going to go, and he went, yeah, okay. And I said, right. It's a long-term job, isn't it?
Well, exactly. It goes back to your point about not knowing when it's going to happen, but being confident that it will.
And he did a brilliant job of not giving me the answer. He allowed me to find the answer, which was, and again, it's something I try and pass on to colleagues now. He said, right, okay, well, let's just strip out the noise and what are the fundamentals? And he just paused. And I looked at him, I said, well, it's got a couple of train stations. People who've heard me talk about this will be rolling their eyes now because they'll be sick of hearing it, but it's not the River Seine, but it's got a river. It's got the inner relief route. It's got the A6, which is a challenge but brings people in. We can do something at scale. He went, well, there are all your answers. We've got spinning fields on the doorstep, which at the time were the highest office rents and residential values outside most of London, I think. Anyway, there's your answer. So it was the scale of the challenge and the commitment. And I think the other thing is, and there will always be those who disagree with the bare bones of regeneration, but I'd like to think we've done as good a job as any at embedding it in the local community. Funnily enough, genuinely, I mentioned I was like jogging before I came here, and I ran past a guy called Neil Harvey who was on the. We formed a regeneration group, Chapel Street Urban Regeneration Group it was called, and it was genuine stakeholders to come and help us guide the plans. It wasn't a open door, come and just shout at us type forum, because they're not that productive, obviously, but it was genuine stakeholders, and Neil was a private landlord, owned some properties, and we still, you still have a really good conversation now, and and there were things we were saying we needed to do that people didn't like, but we're very honest. Funnily enough, that's where I first met Paul Dennett. So Paul Dennett was well before he actually became a councillor. He was the chair of the Blackfriars Residents Association.
Okay.
So he used to come and shout at me in that forum, and now he just shouts at me in a more professional capacity. Yeah.
Well, for those who aren't sort of as familiar with it, it's essentially, Salford Central is essentially in two sections, isn't it? It's got the residential section, which is around Chapel Street, and then New Bailey, as you mentioned, which is the office section. And I mean, one of the things I like to do, and people might call me sad for this, and my wife does call me sad for this, is to go on Google Street View and go back as far as you can. And as far back as you can go is 2008, which is when you adopted the project, and there is nothing there. And then you look at it now, and it is completely transformed. That must be kind of quite amazing to think, having been involved all that time, how much it's transformed. And talking about office rents, but also residential rents, there was nothing there, and now it's kind of setting a new standard in Salford.
Yeah, and that's it's actually even the softer element of that when you're on. So I'm that sad as well, and so again, some people will know this already, but I live in Wigan. This is where my wife's from, and we used to, when we were coming into town with the kids, before they twigged this, when they were obviously a lot younger, there's two ways in. You can go northwestern into Piccadilly, and obviously or Walgate into Central, and even if we were doing something over at Piccadilly end of the city, I'd still bring them in Salford Central so we could look down in the viaduct, and then I'd go, guess what? And they'd go absolutely mad. But when you heard people on the train saying, and I genuinely heard this, somebody saying, oh, that's your dad's scheme, and it wasn't me, it was the plasterer working in the, do you know what I mean, the bricklayer, and that's when you really realise you're having an impact on this, what you do has an impact on people's lives. So seeing it change has been massive. We had, Chapel Street at that point was burnt out buildings. I mean, literally burnt out buildings within a 10-minute walk of Manchester Town Hall. It was It was something else. And in prior to the current days of a more kind of dressed down approach to work, when we still came to work in suits, I genuinely had a change of clothes, because when I was working on Chapel Street, because you'd walk down and I'd get stopped, because the street behind it, on the Islington estate side, had the highest car crime in Greater Manchester at that point, and so it was a pretty challenging place. And like I said, I think we've changed it, but we still kept, still work with communities. We've still we tried our hardest to make sure that we helped businesses, people. We had, we don't talk about it a lot, but we've done a lot of grant work through it's called the Business Group. It used to be called Chapel Street Business Group, who work with as intermediaries without our face in front of it. People buying people suits and what have you for work. So yeah, it was a pretty challenging place. And then New Bailey was known as Manchester's car park. So it was 1,800 or so, 2,000 odd parking spaces. And what all that did for the Salford community was people drove down Chapel Street. So you got all the externalities of traffic. Yeah. People park up, walk over into Manchester, work, spend the money, get back in the car and drive back. So they got all the downside of none of the benefits. Mm-hmm. So the first thing we did was calm Chapel Street, which was supposed to be a 2-odd-year project, and it was around the change of the government from Labour to the coalition, who then pulled all the RDAs and the regional development agencies and the funding. So we'd have lost the funding, which was about £10 million. If we didn't do the work in 9 months. It created absolute carnage. And I can remember now that the MEN did live blogs, like trying to driving down the street. So they started reporting at 7 a.m. So, and I know, and look, I'll laugh about it, and I know some people genuinely were disrupted, but for the community, it had a massive impact. When we first started working there, you could see there's St Philip's School, and there were people. I can remember it now. There was a young mum, a pram toddler going across school, stuck in the middle of what was at that point in the road a 6-lane highway, just trying to go to school, and for no benefit at all. So. Yeah, it was pretty run down, pretty challenged.
Yeah. For all the buildings that have been developed, that's probably, for the community, as you say, that's probably the biggest change that's been made. So it's a very good example of sort of placemaking in action. Fantastic. We could talk about Salford Central all day, and Salford Crescent as well, which you're on with, and the various other projects just in Greater Manchester that Muse are involved in. But let's move on. So the second scheme we're going to talk about is the one you wish you had done. So some people interpret this as one that you admire, that you wish you'd been involved in, or the one that got away. So one that you might have been involved in the early stages, but then it didn't come to fruition for whatever reason. So tell me, Phil, what is the project that you wish you had done?
Yeah, so this is definitely in the admire bit. It wasn't one that we were ever in the frame. In fact, when it started, I don't think we were known as much for urban regen as we are now. We'd done Newcastle Quayside, and we'd done Hume High Street as AMEC, but we hadn't had the impact I'd like to think we've had since in urban regen, and so it's not one that got away. One that I admire, and that's King's Cross, which I think is, as a piece of placemaking, is right up there.
Yeah, it's often highlighted as a really amazing example of what can be achieved. Yeah. And we're always hearing, aren't we, has the potential to be the King's Cross of the north or the east or whatever. Yeah. It's really highly thought of.
I mean, it has everything. And when I talk about this with people, but it was always going to be successful because of this, and we get a tiny bit of that with New Bailey and Chapel Street and with Salford Central, but it's like damning with faint praise. It's that kind of backhanded compliment that because they're looking at it now. And I can remember, I didn't know London that well, but I can remember that was a pretty rough old place. So yes, it had the fundamentals. Goes back to that conversation with Matt. It had the fundamentals, but it needed somebody with nerve and a long-term commitment. And
it was Argent, wasn't it?
It was Argent. Yeah, it was obviously Argent, but from in terms of relationships, we know Peter Freeman very well, obviously from his work at Homes England. And funnily enough, when he first came up and on a fact finding, when he picked up the chair of Homes England, and he came up to see Salford Central through, not just through ECF, but also how positive interventions from Homes England pre-devolution could work. He said, why aren't people talking about this more in the same way as people talk about King's Cross, which was quite a nice thing for him to say. But you look at the placemaking side of it. So you could just jump straight to the Google headquarters, but Google headquarters is there, I would argue, not just because obviously the transport connections, which are about as good as you can ever get, but and I shouldn't downplay that element of it. But you've got St Martin's, and the different, just the education, the kind of culture of it. They kept a school in the same way as we work with St Philip's in a school in Chapel Street. They made sure there was the right mix of residential and what have you. So they understood the pieces of the jigsaw, and we look at it now in terms of people like Google, Universal Music, and what have you. But you don't realise that they're footloose occupiers, but they're very, very savvy. And the work that they do to understand their biggest cost is their people, as most businesses. Yeah. We look at it in pounds per foot. They look at it in cost of recruitment, retention, the talent, and how that can drive the business on. So getting those pieces of the jigsaw right and holding your nerve, the Stockdale thing again. They didn't set it up clearly with an end goal of, and one day it'll be Google's. Part of it will be Google's headquarters. You don't do it that way. You just know that if you build the fundamentals, something good will happen. Yeah,
King's Cross is an interesting one. I was there actually not too long ago, last September, and I remember we kind of just came across it, and I thought, oh, this is the place that everyone talks about and holds up as this shining example of regeneration, and it is amazing. And the one thing that really stood out to me, which I think sets it apart from anything else I've seen, is the public realm. It's amazing, and that's the bit that you don't get a monetary return on investment on. And I think I kind of looked at it and thought it's a bit depressing, really, because the values here, obviously, as you mentioned, the location's unbelievable. The values are, astronomical compared to anything you can get up here. So, and that kind of translates in the quality of what we can deliver in terms of the public realm. And it was a bit depressing, I thought, that this is great, but it's in London, and we're never really going to see anything as good in that way. Do you think that's fair to say?
I think on one level it is. I think the problem is sometimes we naturally equate quality with money, and quality of design is hard work. Timekeepers Square, which is a Salford Central housing scheme we did, wasn't particularly more expensive than any other form of housing, but I remember working incredibly hard with Buttress, and we just kept saying no, them to us. And like anything in life, it's the most difficult thing is to make something simple. So if you remember, and I'll answer the public realm question in a second when I'm setting it up, but if you remember, you did your homework as a kid. If you just typed out, in these days, wrote out in my days, a stream of whatever came into your head first, you might have answered the question in somewhere, but you wouldn't get a decent mark because no one could find it. But the hard work, when you'd done that, was actually distilling it down, rereading it, distilling it down to something a third of the length, but really made the point. And design is very similar, so it doesn't follow that you have to throw a lot of money at something. But if you the most important bit is the bit you touched on, is that it doesn't directly monetize it, or that there'd be such a focus wherever you went. But actually, the reality is, it definitely sets you up. And I'm putting some time into it. So again, if you remember using New Belly as an example, you remember we used to have the marketing suite where the BT headquarters has gone now.
Yeah.
And we spent well over £1 million on that small area, grassed area, some public realms, some resin-bound paths and places for people to dwell, knowing full well that in 3 years we'd rip it up.
Okay.
But it really mattered when we're bringing prospective occupiers, because first thing you tell them is that that's going to get ripped up, but they could see the care that you put into it. Now, it was expensive in abortive terms, but wasn't expensive when you're thinking the building next door cost £30 million to build.
Yeah.
And that's how you've got to see public realm. If you take the care over it, and the other thing I find with public realm is the temptation to remember that we're not pigeons. So you ever see a CGI of public realm, it's always from the air.
Yeah.
Unless you're flying in from the North Sea to Manchester Airport, you'd never see it that way. It's how do you interact with it, and how do you, again, simplicity, how do you walk the piece, walk it, understand where somebody will walk, so you're not putting a piece of some planting on a desire line. So I get your point. I think on one level that's right, but I think sometimes we just did a little bit too accepting of the first level of design. You need to push it. And I'm also open to, in the comment section, people putting pictures of where we've got it wrong, because it is really difficult to get it right.
Yeah,
and believe you me, I've got plenty of examples where I look at now, God, we should have realised that all people were going to do was kick that fence down and walk through, or they were gonna abuse this or do that. There are plenty of examples of that, and that just comes with experience.
It's why I don't envy the team on Piccadilly Gardens. Such a high profile project that you're kind of on a hiding to nothing really. I'm sure they'll deliver something fantastic, but it's like you say, very very difficult to get right. Fantastic. So moving on to the final scheme we're going to talk about today, which is the dream scheme. So if money was no object, what project would you dedicate your time to? Phil, what have you chosen as your dream scheme?
So I thought long and hard about this one, as you'd expect, and I tried to kind of look at it through not from a kind of monetary value lens. So I'd have picked in that respect, I'd pick something in London or whatever, but actually where you'd have the most impact. And I mean social impact, quality of placemaking, where could, if within reason, because I always think money no objects is a dangerous thing, because you end up with waste. Yeah. So having some parameters to work to is actually a powerful thing. It drives the thing I was talking about before, simplicity and and real hard work. But the scheme in the country at the minute that I think has the biggest potential to tick all those personal boxes is the work that the council are doing at the moment with the £90 million grant they got from the previous government, around renewing. I'm going to say renewing the housing market without wishing to capitalise that in the way housing market renewal has been done in the past, but just renewing the housing market in Blackpool, in the centre of Blackpool. Yeah. So literally you come out of the back of the tower, and it's that area which I've been involved in some kind of industry visits and what have you, and I remember going there a few years back with Peter Denton, the ex-chief exec of Homes England, and him coming out of a HMO, visibly moved by how the conditions that some of the kids were living in there. I mean, absolutely visibly moved, and rightly so, and think how on earth have we got this so wrong? And you just think of the impact you can have on people's lives. We're again, not something we necessarily shout about, but we've been working with Blackpool, as you'll know, for many years, but more on the commercial side and around Talbot Gateway.
Yeah, near the train station.
Exactly, and Blackpool North. And but through that work, and we've got a tie-up with the football club foundation, and we're a sponsor of the foundation. And what really struck us there again is, and they're part of that community, obviously, but physically they're next door to what the area we're talking about is, and the number of meals and clothes and what have you they get on a daily basis to families, honest families, families that just found themselves in that position. And you just think, wow, we could get this so right. It's not about it's just about good quality design that can have an impact on people's lives. Like we're doing we've done with Greenhouse, and we're now doing with Willow House, the scheme we've got in Salford Crescent. Yeah. It makes a great headline, the passive house side of things, but the real beauty of it actually is the impact it's going to have on the people who live in there. Yeah. Because the energy costs are about 80% lower than a comparable new build. Yeah. Not something else they could live in, a comparable new build. 80%. That means a meal. That means food on the table during the week for a family. So being able to do that and also have one eye on driving the economy in Blackpool as well. So it's not just about the people who are there, but jobs and what have you. I think that is just something that would be so rewarding. Yeah, so rewarding.
This is the part of the country that has the lowest socio-economic outputs, the whole of the country. And as we know, there's a lot been made of Blackpool. I think, I'm not sure if these figures are 100% up to date, but it did have 8 out of the top 10 most deprived areas of the country. So 90 million from Homes England is a fantastic start. It's probably a drop in the ocean comparatively compared to what we need.
Or the Irish Sea.
So, absolutely.
But it is. That will not get you a brick in the ground. That is all that will do. I say all, it's a big all, is set up the conditions. So it almost gets you to where we were when you were just mentioning New Bailey and Salford Central, whereas there were buildings though that we had to acquire and land we had to acquire and develop, other developers we had to work with, but there was a lot of clear space. It gets you to that point. So it's not, it doesn't get you anything beyond there. And it's really, it can become a kind of a blueprint really for the realities of regen in places like Blackpool, of which there are many. There are many similar places, and it's again back to your kind of mind the gap work. It doesn't get solved by £25,000 per home gap funding. That sort of stuff doesn't get you anywhere near it. It gets solved by a real commitment over a long period of time, understanding how markets work. And when I mean markets, I mean it in the broadest sense. So social rent all the way through, just how you set that to build people up to succeed, and then you wrap it with economic development and everything else. I mean it's pretty powerful stuff, and I think done, as I'm sure it will be, but done correctly, it can be a real kind of case study of how you regenerate some of our more difficult towns and cities in the country.
Absolutely, and if this is done and done well, there's really no excuse anywhere else. This is the lowest of the low in terms of quality and socio-economic outputs, as I said. So if you can get this right, then it really is sort of a platform to build on everywhere else.
There's a very important qualification. We talk about, again, Salford in very positive terms. We couldn't have done anything though without political stability and leadership. Yeah. This idea that developers arrive in a place and change a place is absolute twaddle on their own. They absolutely do not. It needs that first, with a small p, political leadership, a real desire to work together, a real desire to have very honest and open conversations, and we got that with Salford. Whether it was starting out with John Merry when he was the leader through to Paul now, we had that all the way through, and I think Blackpool's got to that place. So the team there, who we know from Talbot Gateway, they're very capable officers. a period, it feels like, of stability in local government. I know they had one or two challenges MP wise over the past few years, but certainly, you know, the leadership feels steady. And, you know, it's like anything, if you had £1 and there's 2 bank accounts you can put your £1 in, and one was kind of fly by night and one was steady, you'd put your £1 in the steady. And again, development, whether it's the £1 or it's the £1 of resource, because you're putting a person to work there you could put somewhere else, that's really, really important. So it's got that, it's got the eye of government, and I think retains that eye of government, started with the last one. So yeah, the I keep using that word, don't I? The fundamentals are there.
Absolutely, yeah. So who knows, by the time you do your next Ironman in 4 years' time, we might be having another conversation about how far we've come in Blackpool. Assuming there will be a procurement process, and you know, I'm sure Muse will be in the mix for that. You seem to be in the mix for most things as well. So 3 fantastic schemes: Salford Central, King's Cross, and Blackpool Town Centre. Phil, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today about your 3 schemes, and thank you very much at home for listening. Please do join us next week for another episode of the Scheming Podcast.